So, with that being said, I have some questions in the chat asking, is this going to be recorded? So I've just started the recording, um, so please don't worry about that. If you have friends who are asking or you yourself want to know, this will be recorded and we will be making it available. So let me just set up screen sharing. Please give me one moment. Okay, great. So you should now be able to see my screen. Let me make it a bit more aesthetically pleasing by going full screen. Today our topic is going to be, as I said, how to write a research proposal. So let's look at the general structure of research proposal first. So as is perhaps to be expected, the general structure of your proposal is going to, mirror the structure of your finished piece, whether that's a thesis or a dissertation or, just an essay for a class. So you're going to have, a brief introduction where you talk about what you're researching and why it's important. You're going to write about the methodology, right? How you are going to do the research, are you going to do qualitative or quantitative research, for example? Literature review, where you look at, what sort of things have already been written about, this question, and what can I add to that conversation? And then a preliminary list of sources, right? So obviously, it's still September. You don't know all of the sources that you're going to look at for your final project, but it's good to get started. And so this will be, some of the sources that you think might be useful to you. All right. So before I dive in detail to what these sections are going to look at, I want to sort of look on a more fine level about what is a research question. So this is something that a lot of students have trouble with. If you ask them what their research question is, they might simply say, oh, I'm writing about politics, or I'm writing about, gender or the law, which is a topic, right? So I think it's really important to understand the distinction between these things. A research question, right, is the question that you will be answering with your research. The topic is merely the sort of general statement of the area of study, right? So without a good question to answer, and we're going to go a little bit more in detail about what makes a good question, you're going to have a lot of trouble, writing a meaningful, high quality piece of research, because it's not going to be focused. You're not going to have a good grip on, what it is precisely that is animating your study. And it's ultimately probably going to be too broad as well. So let's look at the distinction between a topic and a research question with an example. So a topic might be something like air pollution in Bishkek, something which we're unfortunately probably all familiar with. And from that, you can make a number of research questions. So for example, how do Bishkek's strategies for air pollution management compare to those of other Central Asian capitals? Maybe a student who is, studying environmental studies. How does Bishkek's air pollution affect residents' decisions about where to live? Looking at the impact of pollution on economic decisions, such as, renting or buying a home. How does Bishkek's air pollution affect residents' voting patterns in city elections? So looking at the impact of environmental policy on politics, some student who might be in the ICP department. So from this broad topic, you can generate a number of specific research questions in different disciplines. So, so moving on a bit to what makes a good research question. One thing that I hope you noticed about those examples are that they were all specific, answerable with credible sources, neutral, and complex. So let's break these down. So specific, it's not, you know, just an incredibly broad question. So here on this slide, I put some examples of bad research questions. So an example of a bad research question would be, excuse me, something like, how does air pollution affect people? Well, it's a good thing to wonder in an abstract sense, but for a research question, it makes for a poor question. For one thing, when we say affect people, what do we mean by that? Are we talking about their health, their lung health? Are we talking about their mental or emotional well-being? Are we talking about, how it affects what they think about their city? When we say affect, what are we talking about? One thing we'll notice from this question that's distinct from the questions we were looking at in the last slide, these sort of made up examples, is that when we look at this poor example of a research question, we can't tell what field the person is from. Whereas in the examples here, I think it's pretty clear from these examples what field of study the person is from. So if you can't tell what field of study, or it's just an incredibly broad word like effect or impact without sort of a modifier to say affect what or impact what, it's going to be a poor research question. So specific is one virtue we're looking for. So answerable with credible sources, right? So the question should be answerable, right? The goal of your research is to come up with some sort of answer, right? You have to create a hypothesis and then test that hypothesis and then write about your results. If a question is not answerable, then quite simply you're not going to be able to do that. And so it's not appropriate as a topic for your thesis or your dissertation or what have you. So importantly, it should also be answerable with credible sources, right? So I'm sure that you can find some, crazy thing on the internet to support or disprove, supposedly, whatever idea you want. However, it may not be credible. So when you're writing your research, you really need to have a basis of academic articles upon which to draw. So articles that were published in academic journals. So you might find these things on searching on JSTOR, for example, or Google Scholar, right? Excuse me. So if you're having trouble with thinking about what credible sources are, you're not sure what that term means or how to distinguish credible from non-credible sources, we do have resources related to that on our website, which I'll talk about a bit later. But you might also consider booking a session with one of our writing tutors who can talk to you about research skills and that sort of thing. All right, so the next virtue of a good research question that I want to talk about is neutral. In other words, when you look at the question, you don't get the sense that the writer has a really strong, moral point of view or already knows the answer, right? If they already knew the answer, they wouldn't have to do the research. They wouldn't be writing, 50 pages about it. So an example of a poor research question in that respect would be something like, why are politicians too lazy to find a solution to Bishkek's air pollution problem? Right, so this question is sort of assuming that the problem is that politicians are lazy, that that's the reason why Bishkek has the air pollution problem that it does. Right. So I think you can notice from this that it's the tone is not academic, right? It's not neutral. So something that is more measured, more academic, and more neutral is going to be more appropriate. Excuse me. So the last virtue of a good research question that I want to talk about is complexity. Um, a research question should not be a yes or no question because if it was, your thesis would be very short, right? You'd be turning in one page. Um, and it should also be something that you can't just look up on Google, right? If you can look it up on Google and it spits out the answer, then the answer is already known, and you don't need to do the research in order to find the answer. So an example would be like, does Bishkek have an air pollution problem? Well, not only does it have everybody who has stepped outside in December know the answer to that question, I'm sure you can find ample data already to prove that Bishkek has an air pollution problem. So while the topic of air pollution in Bishkek is certainly one worthy of research, I think we can say that this question has already been answered. So other examples of poor research questions: is pollution bad, right? So this is both non-specific, it's quite vague, but also it's not complex, right? It's a question that is asking for a yes or no answer, and quite a simple one at that. So this is, again, is not appropriate. And another one I put here is, how does Bishkek's air pollution impact people's health over a 10-year period? Now, this is not bad per se, but it's not suitable for your senior thesis because you guys don't have 10 years to do a study, right? This is a study that's asking you to monitor people's health over a 10-year period, which is simply not feasible for the amount of time that you guys would have for any given research assignment. So I think this points to another important thing to keep in mind, which is that a research question should be something that you can answer within the amount of time and with the resources that you have. You can find, a great question, something that's really worth asking and worth doing research about. It's just not possible for you to do right now. So as you're, conceiving of your research question and working with your advisor, be aware that you are, of course, limited in what you can do and how much time you have, and conceive of your project accordingly. All right, so with that in mind, let's sort of drill down on the areas of your research question sections. So the first section, intuitively, is the introduction. So here, you're going to talk about what is the focus of your research, why is it important, and what is or are your research questions, which we were just speaking about in more detail. So, if the goal of your research proposal is to convince your professor or your advisor that this is worth studying, you really need to show them the importance of this topic. Why is it worth researching? And hook their interest. You might consider leading with some kind of hook or anecdote before going into the nitty-gritty of your research. So some phrases you might use, or sentences that you might try to complete as you're conceiving of your research project might be things like, this study will examine that. The goal or objective of this project is to something. This project seeks or aims to something. I hope to shed light on something, provided that you can use the word I in your discipline. And this is significant because, right? So these are the sorts of sentence structures that will help you to answer the kinds of question that a good research proposal introduction should answer. So the methodology. The methodology is going to talk about what your research design is. Are you doing qualitative or quantitative research? Are you doing a survey? If so, what kind of survey? You know, um, are you doing interviews? What kind of interviews? This sort of thing. So here we have, what is your research design? How will you collect your data and how will you analyze it, right? Mentioning how you will analyze it is important as well. And then what is your justification for your choice? Why didn't you choose another method? So there are a lot of different ways to, collect data and this sort of thing. So as important as describing what your research design is justifying why you chose it. So you should demonstrate an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of any particular design that you choose. So are there any shortcomings to your methodological design? Are there any flaws in your research design that you should acknowledge? So these might be things like, say you're researching a sensitive group of people, and for this reason it might be difficult to receive responses, or you might acknowledge a potential source of bias in your research design. So these are not things that you should hide. These are things that you should account for and try to adjust for as you design your research project. But ultimately, they are also things that you should mention just to show your reader that you are aware of them and that you have thought about them. So as you're writing or as you're trying to conceive of how to write the methodology section, some phrases you might use or questions you might try to complete for yourself as an exercise would be things like, this study will use or utilize, randomized surveys or something like that. The survey will ask participants about, whatever topics. The goal of the interviews is to, so I put survey and interviews here, but you can select whichever is most appropriate. To recruit participants, I will, right? So you have to make sure that you're reaching a representative sample. So thinking about how to recruit participants is important if that's the sort of research you're doing. So blank method will be used in order to, demonstrate something, show something. So some sort of group or something might be over or underrepresented in the sample. And then lastly, one limitation of this method is ... All right, so moving on to the next section, we have the literature review. Now, we know that most of you will shortly be having to turn in a separate, longer, more in-depth literature review. But it's pretty difficult to turn in a research proposal without having done some research in advance. So you will have, a shorter, more condensed version of a literature review in your proposal as well. And I should mention here that we are planning to do a, fuller, more in-depth literature review session closer to when most students have to turn in their literature review for their thesis. So we will be announcing that shortly, so keep your eyes on your email. But for now, let's talk about the literature review in general terms that will be applicable to the scale that you're doing it on for the research proposal. So a literature review seeks to answer questions like, what is already known about my research question? What theoretical lenses have already been applied or are relevant to this question? What data have other studies found that might be relevant? Is there a hole in the scholarship that I can help fill? Do I find fault with the works of previous authors, right? So I think a lot of students have problems writing the literature review. They might get overwhelmed because they think that they have to research everything to do with the topic, right? So if you're writing about pollution, to go back to the examples that we were looking at earlier, that's an incredibly broad topic that applies to things all over the world. And so here, having a specific research question is really going to help you narrow down the research that you're going to be reviewing in your literature review. And it's really going to help make this something manageable. So if you're just writing about pollution in broad terms, this is going to be, a very difficult thing. But if you're writing about, to take one of the examples we did earlier, how does air pollution in Bishkek affect people's voting patterns? Well, then you're looking at a much more specific problem. So you might be looking at, in other cities, or even specifically in other post-Soviet cities, how has air pollution affected the voting in those areas, or the political activity more generally, right? So you might look at, maybe there are not studies about voting, but there might be studies about protests or other forms of political activity. Or you might look at how other forms of pollution have affected people's political activity, right? So once you have a specific research question, it's going to make the literature review much more manageable as well, because the amount of stuff that you're going to have to read is suddenly going to be very condensed. I think another important thing to know here is that you're not just summarizing everything you've read. You're sort of looking at the most relevant things, the most important things, and you're also bringing an element of criticism. By criticism here, I don't mean saying negative things, but thinking through what are the positives and what are the negatives of what have already been written, or what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses of what have already been written, right? If the goal of a piece of research, whether that's a thesis or a dissertation or an essay for class, is to make an original contribution, then you should be writing something that hasn't been written yet, or that comes from a new perspective. So as you're reading, think about what question has not been answered, and position your research so that you can help to answer that question. So maybe, again, to go back to the examples we've looked at, people have studied how air pollution has affected other cities' voting patterns, but they've never looked at the example of Bishkek. In that case, that's the hole that you're looking at, and that's sort of the gap that you're going to fill. And then, do you find fault? So maybe there is, there are people who have attempted to answer this question, but you think you can see some kind of methodological hole. Or maybe the research, the only relevant research is really old. So maybe nobody has bothered to research this question, or has attempted to research this question in 30 years or something like that. Well, in that case, the hole you're going to fill is you're going to update it. A lot of things have happened in the last 30 years, and maybe updating readers on this question now is important. So that's going to be the hole that you would fill in that case. So some, sentence structures that you might use here, or, phrases you might use in order to help get you thinking, would be things like, other scholars have argued, previous research has found, several or many studies have examined, So these are the sorts of sentences that you might use to sort of begin, to sort of set up. However, these studies fail to, something. So maybe they have failed to consider two factors combined that you're going to look at, for example. One area that has not been studied is ... relatively little is known about ... something is understudied or poorly understood. So here, this is sort of where the critical angle comes in. You're sort of setting up what you're adding, what's already missing, and how you can try to fix that. And then building upon this earlier scholarship, I wish to, right? So you're, again, positioning your research in conversation with what is already known, what's already been looked at, and also explaining to your reader what is new. So lastly, to sort of tie up your research proposal, you might consider what are the real world implications of your findings? What is the value of your research? So to close, bringing it back into the real world and letting your reader understand that this is an important topic that has some sort of some implication for the real world. So phrases that you might use in this regard would be things like, this study has implications for ... The findings of these studies can be applied to some problem in the real world, and this research will help us understand ... So we have prepared a research proposal checklist. So you can screenshot this if you want, or just keep it in your head, or take notes. But as you're creating your research proposal checklist, you should have all of these sections and be answering these questions. So for the introduction, your introduction should be asking or answering, what question will I be answering in my research? So on a very basic level, your reader should come away knowing what you'll be researching and why is it important, right? You have to convince your advisor or your professor that this is an important topic to research, that it's worthy of your time and of their time as a reader. In your methodology section, you should answer the question of what is your research design, right? Are you doing surveys? Are you doing what are you doing, just historical research? What exactly are you doing? And why is this the best way to answer your question, right? So if you're doing historical research, it's not really appropriate to do a survey in the present day. This doesn't really make sense. So you have to answer, why you chose this design, why it's appropriate. And then literature review. What have others said about my research question, right? Not just my topic, but my research question. And what niche can my research fill? What new angle can I bring to this topic? And then your conclusion. What is the value of this research? What sort of implications does it have for the real world? And then you will also have a preliminary source list of things that you will you think that you will be reading or that you have already read in the course of your early stages of research. So it's understandable to get stuck. You might have trouble at some point. So these tips apply, to writing the real thing, the paper or the thesis or dissertation, as well as the proposal. But some tips that I would give is know that you don't have to write from the beginning or the end, beginning to the end, excuse me. So, a common problem people have is that they simply don't know how to begin. They don't know what the introduction should be. And, as I say, this is a problem that a lot of people have. So if that's, the point that is getting you stuck, you might consider switching to a different section. So maybe you don't know what anecdote you want to start with to hook people's attention, or you're having trouble with some phrasing early on. Well, maybe you can switch to the methodology section instead because you're more confident about writing that, or the literature review because you've already done some research and you know what sources you're going to be drawing on there. Is there a different task that you can be working on instead? So maybe you're having some writer's block regarding writing, but you can still do other forms of work related to this project, such as finding sources or reading sources and taking notes, formatting your bibliography, etc. And sometimes switching the type of task you're doing is going to re-energize you for the task of writing. So can you talk with your advisor? Maybe they have some help for you. And then can your peers help? So maybe you have classmates who are researching a similar topic who have some advice for you, or they can read it over and tell you, is this clear, is this not clear? Things like that. And then some further resources. So examples of old student theses are available on the library's website. So this is, I think, really helpful in terms of reading what other senior thesis writers, if you're a senior thesis writer, in your position and even in your same department have written. It might show you just what someone can accomplish in the time frame you have, but also, on a concrete and practical level, show you things like how to format it, good practices for writing literature review in your field, for example, these kinds of things. So the resources for students page of the Works website has a number of guides and examples for you to look at. So Maria, maybe you could put the link in the chat since students can't click the links in my presentation. It might be good to have it just in the chat. And then we also share, resources, including our own resources that we have gathered on our social media accounts. So we have a Facebook page that you can like to look at as well in terms of resources. But yesterday, I just spent some time gathering a number of sources specifically for senior thesis and dissertation proposal writing. So if you want to take a look at those, they have both sort of general guides as well as some examples of actual proposals that students have written. So those should be quite helpful for you if you are stuck. And then, of course, you are welcome to come to the work at any stage. So even if you haven't written a single word and you just want someone to bounce ideas off of, or you just want help finding sources to even begin, you're welcome to come to the work. So you can book a session at our website, work.auca.kg. And from there, it will ask you for your AUCA login information. So you can log in using that. And I guess another important thing to note there is that sessions do get booked, particularly for writing, because we have so many students in classes like FYS who have a lot of writing assignments and who often book sessions, even repeated sessions. So one thing that I would advise you is, as you know that deadlines are coming up, you might book in advance. So if you know that your literature review is going to be due in the last week of September or the first week of October, whatever it is. Sorry, I guess last week of October, because it is the last week of, or coming up on the last week of September now. You might book in advance just so you know that you can have a slot. And we have hours during the day as well as in the evening if that's more convenient for you. And we also have Saturday hours as well. So we hope that through this as well as through our tutoring services, we can be of help to you. And as I say, we're planning other writing related talks this semester. So keep an eye out in your emails for the announcements. And we've also been in touch with advisors for various research-related classes. So you might well be hearing from your professors in that respect as well. So that brings me to the end of this presentation. So let me just halt screen sharing and come back. Do we have any questions? I'd like to open it up for questions. So since there are a lot of people, it's probably best not to open up the microphones just because we might have more than one person speaking at once. But if anybody would like to put a question in the chat, then I'd be happy to read it out loud and then do my best to answer it. And my colleague, Maria Antonella, is here to answer questions as well. Can we have access to your PowerPoints? I'm more than happy to put it on our website. So I'll put it on the Resources for Students page. And then we will also have a recorded version of this lecture if you want to go back and watch it. So thank you for your question. Please go ahead, Maria, if you have something you'd like to ask.
Yes. If anybody is experiencing some difficulty with writing their research proposal and would like to say, well, hey, I'm having trouble with this, what do I do? We'll be happy to, lend you whatever help and give you some advice on that. So if following this presentation, you still have any sort of question, questions, we'll be happy to answer this, because this is sometimes one of the most valuable parts of any workshop is the Q&A. So guys, don't be shy, guys.
So we have some questions here regarding where students can find the recorded version. So Maria, do you think we'll be putting this on our YouTube page? Oh, you're muted.
Yes, we will put it on we will put a link to it on our Facebook page. It's going to be on our YouTube page, and it's also going to be on our web page. So it's going to be all over our resources.
Yeah, and let me get the link for those of you who are not familiar with our YouTube page, so that you guys can take a look and maybe bookmark it for future reference. One moment. All right, so I'm just putting it in the chat. And for those of you who don't know, we have quite a bit of content on our YouTube pages. So, one thing that might be of broad use is we have sort of an introduction video to the work and the kinds of services we offer that might be useful if students are new and don't quite know how to book an appointment, for example. We also do a series on teaching the Kyrgyz language, which might be of interest to students. And then we also record talks that we give. So this would be an example of a talk. And then also we have a number of creative writing talks that we have given as part of their creative writing club, which we help to run. Any other questions? Don't be shy, this is your chance. No questions? Well, Rahul, no questions. Maybe other questions.
Yeah, in general, everything is, I understand. Thank you very much for this presentation, Erika. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. We're more than glad to give this information. We hope it was helpful. And, as we said, people might have slightly different requirements based on, their fields. But it's our hope that it was, general enough to be, broadly applicable to all of you students who were kind enough to join us today. Anything else? Any last last comments or questions?
Oh, can I ask a question? First, thank you for your presentation. I have a question regarding the thesis statement, the research question itself, because even in the AUCA during my junior year, when we were taking or writing some research papers only, or one of the professors told us that there is a big problem with the majority of students with formulating the thesis statement itself. So is there any tips or maybe advices of how to properly formulate the thesis statement and the research question itself? Thank you.
Sure. So Maria, I know that this is something that you talk about a lot with your students, so maybe you'd like to start?
So when it comes to your a senior thesis, right, or a master's thesis, we don't usually start with formulating a position, okay? Because you don't know what your position is going to be yet. You just have a question, okay? So if I may share my screen.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Okay, so I don't know where my stylus is, but so basically, a lot of people are afraid of the word research. You know, say the word to research to the students and they freeze, right? What basically, you have a question, right? You have a question. So the most important thing is to come up with a good question. And Erica gave you, I think, the criteria for a good question, right? It has to be answerable. It has to be not too general. You have to use credible sources. It has to be specific. It has to be fairly specific, that sort of thing. And when you are looking, you know, when you have a question, right? What are you hoping to find, right? What are you hoping to find when you're asking a question?
An answer, right?
Yes, you're hoping to find the answer. And so whatever happens between the question and the answer is the research. Okay, so basically, when we are starting, you know, as senior thesis or a master's thesis, right? We can't really start off with a thesis statement saying, hey, you know, I think that, right? Because at that point, you're not really thinking anything yet. You are just answering, you're just asking the question. You say, well, this is my question, and I think it's important to ask this question because, right? That is what happens, happens before anything else. And that's why in the first part of your research proposal and in the first part of your thesis later on, you are just formulating the question. You are telling us why it is important to have the answer to that question. Okay. If I may give you an example, a couple of years ago, I did a research on, I did my own, I did my own piece of research, and let me share the screen. So this was the research. Basically, I was interested in, because I work for the, for a learning support center that is staffed by peer tutors. I wanted to know, how does a peer tutoring contribute to student success, basically. So I really wanted to know, are we just wasting our time, or are we actually helping our students succeed? Okay, I was very, very interested in finding an answer to that question, right? And I was very interested in finding out not only yes or no, does it help, does it not help? I also wanted to know what specific practices, peer learning practices, contribute to student success, right? Not only what makes, not only whether we are successful or not, whether we are, whether we help students succeed, but what specifically, what practices specifically help students succeed, okay? And that was what I put in my introduction. right? In the introduction to my paper, I said, I am interested in exploring those questions, and I'm interested in exploring those questions because usually when people look at student success, they're only interested in grades on GPA. And I wanted to have a more sort of in-depth look at, you know, at student success, right? Because student success, it's not just grades, it's, you know, it's things like confidence, it's lower stress, it is certain skills that they learn, it is, you know, all, you know, there, you know, and I broke down the, you know, the student success into this like framework, you know, success is this, 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 and that, right? And that's what went into my introduction. I said, it's important to ask those questions because, you know, student success is not just grades. Student success is a lot of different things, and I want to know how our tutors helping students succeed, okay? So I didn't start off saying the work is successful, right? Or the work helps students succeed, right? I didn't start with a statement. I started with a question. So find a good question and explain why it's important, and you're going to have yourself a good introduction. Has that answered your question, Ayim?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Yes.
Erica, we have another question in the chat. A student has asked, what about the hypothesis? What function does the hypothesis have then?
Can I?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah. Thank you for the presentation. As you clarified that we don't need to take a position during the senior thesis for the topic that you're writing about, but
for the proposal, right?
So it is for the proposal.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
So the thesis, the process of writing a thesis, right? You're going to do the research and find an answer, hopefully, to your question. Because you're just proposing right now, you haven't done the research, so it's impossible for you to answer the question. So does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
We have a question about the hypothesis.
Yeah, that was the one that I just read and spoke to.
If I may clarify that.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, the role of the hypothesis, right? So what does hypothesis do? So going back, I can basically just, you know, give you examples from my own research. And I was operating under the assumption that peer tutoring does contribute to student success, right? My question was, how does peer tutoring contribute to student success, right? So that was my hypothesis, that maybe peer tutoring helps student success. But I was fully prepared for the, you know, for the possibility that at the end, it might be that the answer might turn out to be zero, right? That peer tutoring doesn't actually contribute to student success, right? My hypothesis is that it does help, right? But I had to be open to the possibility that it might not help. That is a hypothesis. You take on a certain assumption and you test it, right? And you have to be prepared for the answer to be no. In my case, the answer turned out to be yes, lucky for me, but sometimes it happens that, you know, that your hypothesis doesn't work out, which is fine, because it's also an answer. A negative answer is also an answer. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, all right.
Just to briefly add to that, I think Maria's point also points to something related to methodological design, right? So she said she had an idea, she had a hypothesis that the work services do help students, but she was prepared for the answer to be no, right? So as you're designing your study and thinking about what methodology you use, you need to think about what method can you use that's not biased, right? It's possible to have a poorly designed study that's going to give you an answer that doesn't reflect reality because of, the questions in the survey were biased, or you only asked 5 people, or, some other type of flaw in your research design. So as you're thinking about how you design your research, be thinking about how to do it in a way that it reflects reflects reality as closely as possible and just isn't designed to just spit out one particular kind of answer. We had a question from Ijan, where can we find today's presentation? So as was mentioned previously, we're going to put the slides on our website, so work.auca.kg, under the student resources page. So as a side note, that page is just broadly very useful, but we have a subsection on there related to types of assignments that students get, including a section about thesis research proposals more broadly. So if you look at that, it will be on there, and we will also have the recording on our YouTube page. Any other questions? It seems like no. So with that, I would just like to thank all of you for joining us today. Again, we really hope that this was helpful. And if you have, any other concerns or you need help, you can look at our website, book a tutoring session, or email us at work@auca.kg. So we wish you all a lovely rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right.
Have a nice weekend.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.